Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainability Story podcast. I'm Josina Kamerling. I'm one of the three co-hosts of this podcast, which in turn, we take time to chat to luminaries, practitioners, academics, stakeholders within the net zero and ESG, let's say, environment. And I think it's important to listen to us and hear the different stories and perspectives that each of our guests have. And today, I think we have a very interesting perspective because I have with me Thierry Philipponnat, who has a very long and extensive background, both, let's say, as an industry. He worked in a bank for many, many years and knows the system, I would say, inside out. But he was also a co-founder of the NGO Finance Watch. And Finance Watch is a very interesting NGO because it was founded in reaction, let's say, to the financial crisis of 2008, when policymakers realized that there was no counterpower in the lobbying of finance. And this organization is really serving as a sort of pull the alarm bell, I would say, almost institution. And I have been watching it for many years with great interest. And of course, Thierry, he was its first Secretary General, and then he left to become chairman of the French Sustainable Investment Forum and was also a board member of EuroSIF, the European Sustainable Investment Forum, and also director of the economic think tank Friedland. So I think, Thierry, now you're back since 2022 at Finance Watch as the chief economist, and you really are still analyzing your pet topic, which I think is banking and sustainability. The two have come together because we're seeing that, and I think this is a comment that I found quite interesting at the recent COP28 by President Macron, that financial practices are not integrating climate risk at all, and notably in banking, I would say. And yet at the same time, at the EU and in other areas and regions of the world, we are looking at banking risk, and we're seeing quite a lot of banking failures. We're seeing, banks have an impact, but are they truly engaging in where we want to go towards net zero? And I think that is today's topic, is really on what is the role of the banking sector in the net zero transition, and are we using it correctly? What are the risks? Are we seeing the true risks? What is the interest for the investors in the banking sector? How do regulators need to approach what is still being left out? We know that central banks have been at the forefront of sustainability for a long time through the initiative of greening the financial system. And we know the ECB is a very vocal, let's say, practitioner, and they have quite a few high-level people dealing with this and at the ECB. But what can we do? What can we do to ensure that capital flows are directed towards building a sustainable economy? And the EU Sustainable Finance Agenda, is that actually sufficient? We're going to dig a little bit into the EU Sustainable Finance Agenda because it seems to be the most concentrated. So Thierry, this is a very wide question, but what is your take on this?
Thank you very much, Josina. Pleasure to be discussing those questions with you today and reflecting together, because this is really what this is all about. I think you're asking the right question when you say, what can banks do and what can we ask from them? And if I were to summarize what I'm going to develop further, I think there is so much the banking system and the financial system can do. So yes, the financial system and the banking system are absolutely essential. They're a central piece of the puzzle, but there's so much they can do. But let me develop a bit further. You're asking how we can ensure that capital flows are directed towards building a sustainable economy. Well, let's look at what the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy is trying to achieve. Basically, the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy, Sustainable Finance Agenda, is built on better information, on developing better information, on the belief that when sustainability information is provided with the adequate quality and quantity, capital will flow naturally towards building a sustainable economy. This is really the fundamental principle underlying the entire EU sustainable finance agenda. And you can see it in the three building blocks of that agenda, which is SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and of course the taxonomy. At the end of the day, this is all about information. So EU thinks, hey, I give the right information in terms of quality and quantity, and then capital flows will flow naturally in the right direction, if I can speak like that. Well, let me express a doubt here. Why? If financial markets struggle, as we know, to integrate financial information, which is their most natural commodity, if I may speak like that, to integrate financial information into asset prices, as we know, financial markets are far from being perfectly efficient, then why should they be efficient when it comes to integrated non-financial information, when non-financial information is a much less natural process for them, or much less natural commodity to deal with? And this is the question I'm asking. I would say that better and more and sustainability information is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to orient capital flows in the direction of sustainability. Therefore, what the EU is doing is necessary, and the EU is right to be doing it. Despite all the imperfections, I don't think we're getting, maybe we are later, into the imperfections of the different texts on the table that have been adopted or in the process of being finalized. But my point here is not there. My point is, yes, the principle is right, but we should not think that it will be sufficient to change the world.
Yeah, and I think, let me come in on that, because I find it absolutely pertinent what you're saying. Looking at what an NGO in the UK did recently, they analysed the biggest listed companies on the London Stock Exchange and analysed them for climate risk if they were showing the true risk that they had. And they actually found that in the financial statements, and not even the non-financial statements, in the financial statements, climate risk was misrepresented or not present in 75% of the cases. And I think that is to your point, is that it's incredibly difficult. And it actually means there should be a change. And this is something I've been discussing with some groups that are brainstorming on the future of capital markets, is that, the current structure of the capital markets, of course, is not sufficient to affect the kind of change that we need to do in order to affect and go towards a net zero. And then, if we look at financial instability, we see climate change is going to affect massively. And every year, and to give a sort of very pragmatic example, flows of the recovery fund from the EU have been going towards countries like Greece, which have been dealing with the biggest climate change and fires that have been affecting over the last years. But what is happening in Greece, for example, is that the money sent is being used to post-address. So what are they buying? More airplanes, more firefighters, etc. But they're not actually dealing with the issue, which is that you need to manage the forest. You need to, you need to plan before the fire comes. And I think this is a general story that I can see where regulators have a problem, and where, we are dealing with a very strange system where we're using the current system to affect something that is massive and very different. So, sorry, this was a bit long-winded, but I get on to my pet topic, Thierry. Going back to that financial instability issue and how regulations are addressing and can help fine-tune and really change the system. What is your perspective on this? How do you see this?
Yeah, thank you. You're putting the finger on something absolutely fundamental in the example you just gave. Take the example, and that will take us directly to prudential regulation, but take the example of fossil fuel investment. If you have been invested in fossil fuel reserves for the past 3-4 years, you've been very clever. Because for all the reasons we know, geopolitical and everything, it's been extremely lucrative. It's been extremely profitable. And therefore, from a financial standpoint, you've made a lot of money. You've been clever. Well done. Now, look at the very same topic from a sustainability standpoint. We all know the stranded asset narrative, and let me summarize it in a very short sentence. If we want to limit global warming to, say, plus 2 degrees, 80% of fossil fuel reserves will have to be left under the ground. So that means that 80% of the reserves will be worth zero. Okay. Now, how do we reconcile the fact that financial markets are saying, hey, I love being invested in oil, gas, and coal because it's profitable. And at the very same time, I know that, is it 10, 20, or 40 years from now? I don't know. 80% of that will be worthless. The answer to this question is a question of time horizon. And reconciling time horizon is really the heart of the issue. And this is the key question we have to reconcile if we want to make financial markets integrate both financial perspective, which is their natural purpose, their normal purpose, and sustainability. But now let's go into your question about financial instability. The current legislative framework, prudential framework, does not take into account existing systemicity risk. Let me take an example. And the example is exactly the one I just gave. Take the example of fossil fuel reserves. Banking regulation, namely CRR, capital requirement regulation, tells us that if a risk is deemed to be particularly high, the risk weight that banks should apply to their exposure should be 150%. As we know, 150% risk weight means you take 8% basic capital requirements, so 150% of 8% is 12% capital requirements. That's what CRR is telling us. In the context I was describing of stranded assets that will, regardless of the situation, require that we leave 80% of fossil fuel reserves on the ground, clearly fossil fuel reserves are particularly risky. Despite that fact, the risk weight received given on fossil fuel exposures is, in the vast majority of cases, somewhere between 20 and 50%, depending on the internal models and the ratings of the companies raising the money. So what I'm saying here is that when regulation says if it's very risky, apply 150, the reality is that we're applying between 20 and 50.
Yeah.
And if you go one step further, think of further exploration of fossil fuel reserves. Well, you think, if we already have far too many reserves compared to what we can afford to extract and burn, any additional reserves will just be wasted money. I'm not talking about, the future of the world here. I'm just talking about investment risk. That money will be wasted. You and I, you see now, as financiers, know that if we still want to do something which is particularly risky, we should fund it out of equity. It's basic financial principle. You still want to do it? Fine. Fund it out of equity, not out of debt. So therefore, we should apply full equity funding. And what's really interesting is that in the very recent review of CRR, which is the EU dimension of the Basel or implementation of the Basel agreements, all the co-legislators, Parliament and Council, decided not to change the rules and to continue applying those very lenient rules to fossil fuel investment, despite the fact that prudential regulation does not cover an obvious risk. Long story short, it's exactly the same story with Solvency II and investment in fossil fuels by insurance companies. So no, the prudential regulation does not reflect the risk that society is taking and financial enterprises are taking when they invest on fossil fuels. And that has basically two implications. That has a financial stability implication, because obviously if you don't cover your risk properly, well, we run the risk of accumulating a financial crisis on top of the climate crisis. Another way of saying that is that we might have 2008, 2009 again on top of the climate crisis, maybe something not very desirable.
No.
And the other thing is, effectively, when you think about it, given the fact that the job of financier is to put a price on a risk, if you underestimate the risk, you underestimate the price. So therefore, the capital allocation process, without going into instability or financial crisis dimensions, the allocation of capital is not done at the right price. In other words, we're subsidizing implicitly the financing of something that will destabilize the financial system. So we have something fundamentally wrong here.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting. As I was listening to you, I was thinking that the real issue we're facing, all of us, with this tremendous challenge we have on climate and how to bring it into our financial system in the correct way is, I think, and again, I'm going to take another example because I'm all for very vivid examples, as you know. And I was recently reflecting on, after COVID and the office spaces and empty buildings everywhere and the lack of foresight we have shown as sort of blindly following a path of building which is not really where our world is going to, and reflecting on the Middle Ages, where they might take 200 years to plan and build a cathedral, which is still standing 800 years later.
Uh-huh.
And why is it that people in the Middle Ages were able to really reflect in a very long-term perspective? Why is it that we, with all our sophistication, our systems, our capital markets, are so short-term? And, the whole issue of transition, pricing of risk, looking at the true risks in the system is part and parcel. And I was in June at the IOSCO annual conference speaking to many different regulators. And each time it was, how can CFA Institute analysts help us price transition risk, look at transition financing to deal with the risk issues? Well, it is an issue, but, whenever regulations come out, and you mentioned the EU CRR and the recent tweakings of it, we're still not addressing it correctly. So, Thierry, I know Finance Watch has been very vocal on it. What you would propose that we can do to tweak properly and look at this issue?
I think the key point in what you just described, Josina, is to get more granular when we talk about risk. What does risk mean? Oh, Thierry, that's just not a very interesting question. We all know what risk means. Do we? What time horizon are we talking about? The problem with our current system, and it's not an easy one to solve, by the way, is that risk is defined every second, I was going to say. In other words, well, first of all, we have, all traders in the world, mark their portfolios to market every night. So every day you mark your portfolio to market. And then, fair value accounting at the end of the day, IFRS and everything tells you, the value of your investment is their market value at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Hence the fact that, if you take the example I was giving earlier of fossil investments, comes 31st of December, take the photo for your balance sheet. Hey, your investment in oil has gone up 40% this year. Well done, cool again. And the people who made the decision get rewarded for that. And human beings, there's no judgment in what I'm saying. Human beings behave according to what they're rewarded for. It's a fact. There's nothing new in that. There's nothing spectacular in what I'm saying, but let's not forget it. As long as people will be rewarded on short-term profits or valuations, that problem will not be resolved. Because when you think about it, the one standard deviation move in a market is a huge event for a day trader. It's a complete non-event for a 30-year pension fund investor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And once you said that, you've said almost everything. So do we want to be 30-year investors, or do we want to be day trader? And there's no judgment about being a trader. Being a trader is perfectly fine. But, maybe it should not be the part of the system. Let me give you a very concrete example. I love concrete examples as well. Solvency II. I've been doing a lot of work on Solvency II, giving evidence to the European Parliament on what should be done or not done, precisely on the topics we're discussing. In one of the conferences, I was discussing this topic. I was saying that, everybody agrees that we need insurers to be long-term investors. I could not agree more. That's on the asset side. And then I was saying, well, in that case, let's consider risk in the long term. And the response I got from, the people who didn't want to change anything is, oh, no, that doesn't work, because we assess risk each year. So we're saying we want insurers to be long-term investors, but we judge their risk every year.
Yeah.
It cannot work. It's just, there's an incompatibility here. There's something absurd in the system. So
but Thierry, this is even before the financial crisis, the financial system was going down that road. I worked in a bank up to about 2005 when I went to the European Parliament. And I remember, my goals were extremely short term. And I was managing big loan portfolios for energy clients. And again, we would not go into project financing, for example, for wind, because the timeline was far too long and the risk reward was just not coming out in the way we wanted it to come. And, this is again, I know I went back to the Middle Ages, but even the 19th century, when they were building railways, they had a far longer horizon on risk and profit than we have now. And you pointed it to that mismatch. And there is no blame game. It's just the situation we're at. But we should be able to match, both long term and I on both sides. And I think this is an incredibly important point that you raised.
Yeah. And we have to bear in mind that this phenomenon is reinforced by the fact that financial assets, by definition, when they're quoted, when they're listed, are liquid. I'm not saying it's wrong intrinsically. I'm just saying it has very broad and far-reaching consequences. If you invented a world that is not our world, where if you buy a fossil fuel company, you cannot sell it for the next 40 years, I'll bet you nobody would buy them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
People buy them today, investors buy them, because they know that they can get out. And each investor has that explicit or implicit belief that he or she is smart and will be able to get out before everything collapses. And in the meanwhile, will have benefited from the situation. And this is what created the situation we're in. If we didn't have that liquidity, fair enough, I'm reinventing a world that is not our world today, the situation would be completely different. So reconciling time horizons is also about being conscious about that dimension.
Yeah, maybe, it's interesting because we keep turning around the point that we need to think of the financial system as not just maybe being profit base, but also looking to the common good of mankind. And this is incredibly difficult because companies, and investors, it's all about having the profits, and it's not so much about doing good. And I think this is something that is incredibly difficult. I remember writing papers when I was in the European Parliament and the think tank part, saying, there's some part of that financial system that has to be for a common purpose. And then, there ought to be, we ought to have a core part that is very long-term, not subject to liquidity, and where you get a completely different kind of momentum that is then able to affect this huge change of how we need to react regarding the climate. I mean, I can't remember, maybe I'm quoting it wrong, but I think, at the moment, we're using, I think, the equivalent of 2 worlds output, which of course is totally non-sustainable. So it's really we are in a I would say in a train that is going ever faster towards certain destruction. And I hate to be negative, but because I'm a very positive person, but sometimes this is what it comes across.
You're absolutely right. But let's take it one step further, if you allow me. This is about doing good, but this is not only about doing good. Because after all, the cynics could say, hey, I don't care. We will have a job in this world. My job is not about doing good. My job is about making money. Okay, fine. But let's take it, as I said, one step further. There will be no profitability. As a matter of fact, there will be no economy if the world is not sustainable. So even if you don't care about the future of the world, you don't care about your children and grandchildren. Hey, after all, as we say in French, après moi le déluge. Fine, okay, I don't care, painting, the complete cynic. Well, even for that cynic, that person has and should understand that there will be no such thing as a profitable economy, or as an economy, as a matter of fact, if the world is not sustainable. And that seems to be forgotten all the time.
Yes,
and
I agree.
80 or 90% of what we've been discussing today is about risk management. It's about financial materiality, as we say in sustainable finance jargon, even before we can start talking about impact materiality. And this is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and it's so I totally agree with you. I think it's important to keep that cynical view as well. Every time, though, we see legislation come out, and we, to go back to the beginning, I think it's very admirable that the EU has been so bold, and it is one of the regions in the world which has been the most bold with regards to sustainability. But we see again and again the political will tweaking what comes out in the end. And to focus a little bit on what's been happening in the EU for our listeners, recently, and as you know, at the EU level, there is a two-way process, a two co-decision-making process for most financial services files. So there is a lot of give and take between the European Parliament and the member states at the Council formation. Recently, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which was all-encompassing and also for banks, has been tweaked down in its final stages. Now, I have to say it's not final yet because the final wording hasn't come out, but there has been an in-principle agreement. And again, excluding the financial sector from the scope of the directive is not going to help towards what we've just been discussing. Thierry, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's fundamentally wrong. And I belong to the camp that says that don't ask too much from the financial sector. So I'm not saying financial sector is responsible for everything, but obviously the financial sector is at the heart of the economic system. By nature, by definition, every bit of GDP is finance. So, financial sector is at the heart of the economy. If you exclude the financial sector, by definition, you're missing that part of the economy which is everywhere. So if you believe that corporate sustainability due diligence directive is meant to achieve something, include the financial sector, because otherwise you're emptying the directive from one of its many main dimensions before it even existed. So this is really wrong. The one thing that is not so bad in the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, is that financial institutions will have to have a transition plan. And that goes in the right direction.
Yes, I agree.
So, let's not throw baby with bathwater. There's some bads, I just mentioned them, but there's some goods as well. And transition plans are essential. The key about transition plans is to define precisely what we're talking about. Because Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive talks about transition plans. Banking regulation talks about transition plans. There's discussion about it in insurance regulations. The truth is that today, there's no rigorous definition of what a transition plan should be.
Yes.
And until we have that, we have a very nice principle. All good willing people will say, hey, yes, we need transition plan. Good, job done. Oh, no, job is not done. Until we've defined very, very, very precisely what a plan is and who enforces it and what measures are taken if the plans are not followed. Until you've done that, you've done nothing. Of course, we have the corporate sustainability, not due diligence, CSRD reporting directive that talks about transition plans as well. And the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are the standards that will concretely convert the CSRD into practice that are being elaborated. Difficulty we're facing here is that the European Commission last year gave instruction to the body in charge of thinking about the ESRS, European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and proposing what they should look like, EFRAG. By the way, for the sake of transparency, I'm a member of the Sustainability Reporting Board of EFRAG. So the European Commission gave instruction to EFRAG to delay the work it had started to do on sector-specific standards. And that has terrible consequences. Why does it have terrible consequences? Well, very simply because we can all see that the transition plan for a retail company is not going to be the same as the transition plan for a car company, which is not going to be the same as the transition plan for utility. It's obvious. You don't need, an expert to say that. Until you have sector-specific standards, you will not have a precise definition of what the transition plan for those different sectors are. And until you have that, we will be talking about, let's have a transition plan. But effectively, we will not know what we're talking about. And now this is being delayed by a significant number of years. And when I say significant, the reality is that nobody knows, but we're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, nobody knows. That's eternity, given that the carbon budget of the planet is today 5, 8 years. In 5, 8 years, we'll have exhausted the carbon budget of the planet and we'll have breached the Paris Agreements. So we have no time to lose. And despite that, with the rationale of not putting too much burden on companies, which everybody can understand, we all understand that. We all hate bureaucratic burden. We all understand that. But this is the wrong reason. Because the reality is that if we don't embark in that direction, well, all businesses will be impacted.
Yes, a, a wonderful conclusion for our podcast, because where we have gone is say, it's not enough to say we need transition plans or be very generic about it. As you say, you need to be very specific and very concrete. And I like particularly also that you do say, we don't want to overburden companies. Nobody wants to do that, but we know that time is finite. We have 8 years, and we don't seem to be going in the right direction. There are, of course, initiatives, but I think we need to get that feeling of urgency much more. And I hope that this podcast can help to build that feeling of urgency. Thierry, in your conversation today, it's been very, very interesting, very thoughtful. I thank you very much for this chat, and I hope we have many more on this. Thank you very much, Thierry.
Thank you very much, Josina. It was a pleasure.